everyone. Welcome to Humans Wanted, BC's War for Talent. I'm Carla Sorrell, editor of Douglas Magazine. We're really proud and excited to sponsor this talk today. Thank you to everyone who has and is starting to join this conversation. This session is part of the second annual Rising Economy Week, which has been going on for the last 2 days. I'm sure some of you have enjoyed some of the incredible talks in person and virtual, hosted by South Island Prosperity Partnership. This is just one of the more than 20 sessions building momentum for a more resilient, innovative, sustainable, and equitable post-COVID world. I know we're all taking a lot out of this that we'll be able to bring back into our jobs, our communities, our collaborations. So I can't wait to see what comes out of everything. Hopefully some of you are familiar with the format of the talks. In a moment, I will turn things over to our speakers, but first a quick overview of how things will work. About halfway through the talk, we'll be opening up questions for the speakers. So you can submit any question anytime through the Zoom Q&A, but those questions will be handed over to the speakers halfway through the talk. Q&A is just below this video link. The session is being recorded and you can submit your questions anonymously if you prefer. To interact with other attendees, please use Zoom or WOVA chat. The production team will monitor the WOVA chat as well for Q&A for those who are joining through the app. And finally, if you're posting your takeaways to social media, please use the hashtag Rising Economy Week 2021. So there's a lot to remember, but we're all pretty familiar with the format now. And thank you again. This is a really important conversation, a really important topic that I know we're all struggling with or looking for solutions for in different ways. So I'm really excited to hear what Cynthia and Andrew are going to say today. It's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Cynthia Leach. Apologies, Cynthia. She is the Senior Director of Economic Thought Leadership with RBC Economies. Cynthia helps shape the narratives and research agenda around RBC Economies and thought leadership teams' forward-looking economic and policy analysis. She joined the team in 2020 and previously was an executive at Finance Canada. So I'm going to hand it over to Cynthia for this exciting conversation.
Thank you, Carla, for having me and everyone for joining us to talk about what we're all talking about these days, which I think is in part labor shortages. We know that human capital is a critical ingredient to economic growth. And as we move beyond recovery from the pandemic, we know that jobs demand and labor supply are being disrupted. So to talk about what we're facing and how Canada and BC compete in this war for talent, I'm happy to be joined today by Andrew Petter. Andrew is President Emeritus of Simon Fraser University and a professor in its School of Public Policy. He also serves as board chair of Innovate BC. Before joining SFU, Andrew taught at the University of Victoria Faculty of Law, where he was dean from 2001 to 2008. From 1991 to 2001, he served as a BC MLA and held numerous cabinet positions, including finance, advanced education, and attorney general. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Great to be here, Cynthia.
So let's dive right into it with what everyone's talking about, labor shortages. Why don't we level set on the facts here? What are you seeing and hearing in BC?
Well, I think in BC, I haven't attended a conference on the economy where labor market shortages, the need for talent has been very much a top of mind issue. We have the tightest labor market in Canada. In part, that's for good reason. It's because, in fact, we also have the greatest job growth in Canada post-pandemic or coming out of the pandemic. I wish I could say post-pandemic, but coming out of the pandemic. And I would say the situation is particularly acute here in the South Island. South Island has an even lower unemployment rate than the rest of Canada. The South Island, I think, also has a relatively high living costs, a very low vacancy rate for rental accommodation. So all of the pressures that are being felt nationally are being felt even more so in BC and even more so here in the South Island.
Yeah, and in terms of the national picture, BC is particularly acute, but this is something, labor shortages are being felt across the country. We know that there are record job postings right now in Canada, about 5% of jobs a record high, even if the series is not very long. And businesses, about 30% are reporting labor shortages. And this is not in just one particular sector. It's across sectors, even though it's particularly acute in the industrial sectors, like for skilled trades, but also in the hospitality sector. And, it's a question of numbers. If you take a step back and look at recovery in labor markets, hours worked at a national level have recovered from, their pre-pandemic levels. The labor force has recovered and the unemployment rate has almost recovered. There's only about 150,000 people left to come back into the jobs market. And yet we have, in the hospitality sector, over a labor market gap still of about 300,000 people, an employment gap in that area. And so, it's a math. There's not enough unemployed people to fill those jobs that are missing in that sector. And it's because there's been job growth in other areas of the economy. And so we're going to have to look to things like an expanding labor force to fill that gap. And yet Canada has some of the highest labor force participation rates in the world. And maybe that goes back to what we know is the ultimate driver, a lot of this. And it's, population aging. It hardly comes as a surprise. But Andrew, why does it feel acute now? And how will the pandemic impact it, do you think?
Well, just to reinforce what you were saying, Cynthia, I saw a recent survey that I think 2/3 of entrepreneurs across the country have said they've lost economic opportunities by not being able to attract talent. So as much as we are growing here in BC, we're not growing as fast or as well as we could be if we had access to more talent, more labor. I think the situation you've mentioned, the pandemic has been disruptive. There's been a lot of mobility or dislocation, if you want to put a different word on it, people leaving certain sectors for others. And that has caused some mismatching in terms of now the demands as businesses reopen. I think immigration rates obviously were not achieved during the pandemic, and we count on immigration to make up the difference between those who are leaving due to retirement and aging and those who are coming in, because there's a serious gap there. So those are contributing factors. But I would say even pre-pandemic, the jobs outlook in BC, the labor forecast of the BC government, projected over 10 years about 850 job openings that would have 850,000 job openings that would have to be filled. And even if you accounted for the influx of young people coming into the labor market, projections, fairly optimistic projections on immigration and some in-migration from the rest of Canada, there was still a serious shortfall, even pre-pandemic, of about 50,000 workers who could not be identified in that forecast. Now, the situation has been exacerbated, I think, for some of the reasons that you've mentioned and I've added to. And frankly, I'm a little skeptical about labor market forecasts. They tend not to be as dynamic as the economy itself is. And I think, in fact, there is going to be an even greater need for talent than that forecast would suggest going forward.
Yeah, it's not, and labor shortages are not just a pandemic issue. They were there before the pandemic, and some of these numbers are pretty stark when you think about the impact of population aging. So our labor force participation rates peaked around the financial crisis, and they're 3 percentage points below now, which is about 1 million fewer people in the labor force. And if we project those forward, even accounting for the fact that older Canadians are in the workforce for longer, that could be 1 million fewer additional people in Canada, and up to 600,000 over the next 3 years. So that's pretty consequential.
I think your own statistics show that during the pandemic, some people have stayed in the labor force who might have otherwise come out, but now we're going to have an effect of more people leaving the labor force because of those who deferred their retirement decisions while they were able to work remotely and the like. So we're about to be hit even more by that exodus than we have been in the last few years. I believe I'm relying on your numbers here, Cynthia, but I think that's what they show.
That's exactly what we're saying. And asset values have increased as well. So it might affect the timing of people's retirement. So that's the people. But, the other factor I think we got to touch on here is the changing nature of work and skills and what that might do. Do you want to comment on that, Andrew?
Well, I think the challenge is, how are we going to develop the talent pool that we need? How are we going to attract talent to the province? How are we going to retain talent within the province? And those are all challenges. I think there are some real opportunities within those challenges. I do think that there will be a shift. I think there will be some displacement of lower skill work by automation, but that will be more than offset by the demand for higher skill workers. That same labor market outlook pre-pandemic said that over 75% of those new jobs would require some form of post-secondary education. I think those numbers are conservative. So we're going to have to really invest a lot more in skills and training and post-secondary education. Here in BC, I think we've relied a lot on in-migration and immigration to bring in the really high-end talent. We have not invested in graduate education, for example, and in research-based skills that can really drive an innovation economy. And of course, the international market for those kind of skills is much tougher now than it was before. We're going to have to invest more. I hope we do invest more in providing more opportunities for graduate education, particularly graduate education that's linked to the job market than we have in the past. So there's opportunities and need in the education sector. There's going to be need to put a lot more in retraining of workers as workers shift from one sector to the other, require new skills, new aptitudes. That's an area where I don't think the public education system has done as much as it will need to do in the future. So we're not just talking about students coming out of high school and going to university or college or other forms of training. We're talking about people who are in the job market whose skills can still be valuable if they get further training. In the tech sector, for example, there's a real need for people with marketing skills, with HR skills, with managerial skills. And there are people in other sectors whose jobs are at risk or maybe leaving those sectors who could fill those jobs with a bit of retraining and effort in that regard. And then we're going to have to really look at how do we get more people to come into the labor market. Childcare is not just a great social policy in terms of supporting kids and helping parents, particularly women, but if it is in fact real, if we can really provide childcare in a meaningful way, we can make it possible for a lot more women to enter the workforce. And that can add hugely to the talent pool, help them achieve their potential, at the same time, add to the potential of our overall economy. And I think of other population groups, Indigenous people, one of the fastest growing populations here in BC, but one that has not received the same level of education and opportunity as other populations. If we do right through reconciliation and other initiatives to support Indigenous communities and people to increase their capacity, we will being right by the whole province and the whole economy. So there's things we can do, but it's going to require us all working together to do them.
That's a lot of great stuff there. I just want to maybe unpack a couple of those things and also get a chance to talk about some of the things we think about in the shifting nature of work and skills over the last few years, but certainly propelled with the pandemic. And, what are the drivers of those shifts? Well, certainly it's, the green economy, the digital and tech-focused economy, also the aging population, which brings with it, a population that's more likely to consume healthcare and other services. And, on the green and digital side, that favors, certain specific technical skills. But as you noted with your tech employment example, there's also a lot of other employment opportunities around that, including in the infrastructure build out. And hence going back to where we've seen long-standing labor shortages in the skilled trades. And so when we think about, those might be areas where there's particular job growth. But when we also think about skills, what are the key messages on skills? Well, again, it's, there's going to be some roles, an increasing share of roles with these very technical knowledge or skill bases. But, there's also a need for these human skills or professional skills, whether it's an entrepreneur as a skilled tradesperson, whether it's someone who has to, in a highly technical field that has to work across disciplines and understand how to collaborate in that way. And, you talked about automation. As technology take away some of those routine tasks, where does the value lie? But in those inherently human, creative, collaborative, problem-solving skills. And along with that idea of disrupting some of these lower skilled jobs, it's not necessarily about any one skill, because skills tend to be co-located. People tend to have, high competency across skills. And so in general, what we're seeing though, and can expect to continue to see, is just a general requirement for higher proficiency with skills.
No, I completely agree. In fact, it's always been interesting to me that when you actually read what businesses say they need in workers, they often, almost always highlight things like adaptive skills, writing skills, critical thinking skills. So as much as it's important to provide certain technical aptitudes, those technical aptitudes may not last very long. We see how quickly technology is changing. People have to be able to retrain themselves and to be open to change within the workplaces and the society they operate. So we should not devalue some of those humanistic skills that come with liberal arts education around critical thinking, writing, communication, HR, relationship building. In some ways, those are going to be even more important going forward. And if I can put in another plug, one of the bugaboos that I've had as we shift in our thinking as an economy away from an extractive economy to an economy that's really about adding value. I don't think we can anticipate where the needs will be in the future. Who would have thought we had a need a few years ago for people to model populations that are suffering from viral diseases, for example, to the extent we have, or indeed the technology that's gone into producing some of the vaccines that have done, or the changes that are taking place. And I think we really need to stop thinking of the labor market as something that follows the economy and start thinking of investing in human capital as something that will in fact drive the economy in ways we can't possibly anticipate. I'll give you an example from my own university, SFU, where a couple of researchers, actually one was on a honeymoon, managed to notice the blue morpho butterfly and its translucent blue wings, decided to study it, and realized that the blue color was produced not by pigment, but by nano holes in the butterfly wing. Make a long story short, that researcher partnered with a business entrepreneur, and it's now produced an amazing anti-counterfeiting technology, which is being used around the world. In fact, when my son went to the European Cup soccer championships, the tickets that he used had embedded in them the technology that was developed from the blue morpho butterfly wing. Well, who could have anticipated that research on the blue morpho butterfly wing would produce a major economic opportunity in anti-counterfeiting? And that's just one of thousands of examples we could have. But increasingly, with the pace of change, we need people who are driving economic opportunity and can adapt to changes in not only the labor market, but in technology itself, if we're going to be successful. So we got to invest in that high-end talent and in those adaptive skills, as well as in providing people with the specific technical aptitudes that they need in the current marketplace.
So, I mean, there's a role for there's a role for everyone kind of in solving this problem. There's public policy, there's employers, we can talk about all that, but for a moment, just because of your great background in education, how are educational institutions, if you can generalize or feel comfortable doing so, how do you think educational institutions are viewing their role here? Are they feeling it's shifting? Are they trying different strategies?
Yeah,
what
I think
opportunity does digital represent?
I mean, I may be biased, but I think in BC, we're actually blessed with an educational system that has huge strength because it is differentiated. We don't have just research-intensive universities. We have colleges, we have institutes, we have teaching universities. And even amongst the research universities, we have very different strengths amongst those universities. So that differentiation in the strengths of those institutions and what they can provide to students is a real strength. We also have a strong culture of work integrated learning in this province that spans the system. And I'm a big believer in work integrated learning. I know businesses are not investing as much as they used to in on-the-job training. I think that's to some extent understandable because they can no longer count on the employees staying with them for as long as they could in the past. I don't think universities by themselves or other colleges can provide on-the-job training in substitute, but what they can do and what they are doing is putting more and more emphasis on work integrated learning, co-op opportunities at the graduate level. MyTax does a wonderful job of placing graduate students into work situations. And those people are picking up skills as they're learning that then become very, very useful and easily integrated into the labor market. So I think universities are doing a lot in that area. I think universities are somewhat frustrated that there has not been the investment historically in this province that there should have been in graduate education and in research-based skills. This province has not invested. In fact, this province has underinvested in R&D generally compared to other provinces. That has to change, and I think universities are ready to step up and address that change. I think there is a shift taking place across the system towards more micro-credentialing, and that can be very helpful in meeting particularized needs that exist, provided, based on our earlier discussion, I agree with you, it's not a substitute for also providing students and workers with those skills of adaptation and communication and the like. But micro-credentialing can be a very valuable addition to the suite of educational programs that are offered. I think the other thing that in this province, particularly the post-secondary system, is really important, and that is as a conduit for immigrant labor to both attract students from other countries, but also thanks to our immigration policy and the work integrated learning opportunities, post-secondary institutions provide those international students opportunities to gain work experience, to gain labor market attachment, and with the more positive immigration environment we have nationally, those students can stay on as landed immigrants and become citizens eventually and become part of our workforce. And that is going to become even more important going forward. So the post-secondary system is an important component of gaining some of that immigrant labor that we're going to need and providing it with a kind of additional training and skills to enable those students to achieve their full potential when they enter the labor force and contribute to the labor force and to the economy to the fullest extent possible.
What about, to the extent to which educational institutions are working with employers? Because as you said, employers have not invested, traditionally in training. We know that highly skilled workers in Canada are 5 times more likely to receive on-the-job training than lower skilled workers, and that's a particularly stark ratio across the OECD. With labor shortages might incentivize employers to invest in their employees, and as they might invest in machinery and equipment. But, big employers like an RBC have more resources to think about the skills of the future and how to, assess skills and train employees to meet those demands. But one thing that's a kind of a pet issue for me is, small business is such a large part of this country in terms of the number of businesses and the jobs that it creates. And yet, let alone, the normal issues, there's definitely some pandemic constraints for small businesses that make it really difficult to think about the future, especially in isolation. And so I wonder what opportunities, there are for partnerships between employers or employer groups, small business groups, and educational institutions to be thinking a step ahead in planning for jobs and skills.
Yeah, well, I think it is starting to happen to a greater extent. I mean, as I say, work integrated learning is already a very strong platform at most institutions, which creates those kinds of partnerships and has been very successful. But there's also other opportunities. There's an initiative that Innovate BC is supporting called Palette Skills Initiative to retrain workers. And universities are supportive and working together with the Business Council on those kinds of initiatives. There's a move towards micro-credentialing, which is targeted very much at the needs of the business community. But I would say, Cynthia, I think, BC still hasn't moved to the extent that I think we need to move from that kind of resource mentality mindset to a more innovation mindset. How do we add value? And to do that, we're going to need a lot more collaboration, not just in the skills training, but also in leveraging the capacity of universities to provide research support and innovation support to businesses to develop new products and to respond to some of the challenges that they face around climate change and the like. And so conferences like this and organizations like the South Island Prosperity Partnership are models of how we start to create that conversation where we have post-secondary institutions working much more closely with business, big and small, government at the table, and we're all working together and trying to solve these problems. I mean, climate change, huge challenges, but also huge opportunities. We're going to need workers who are going to be able to assist business to make the shift and reduce their carbon footprints. We need to have a good communication because there's capacity within the post-secondary institutions. There's capacity within the innovation economy to assist resource industries and others to make that shift, but they need to start talking to each other to a lot greater extent than has been the case in the past.
I'd second that. I want to touch for a little bit more onto immigration. And, one stat that I find very interesting is The government announced higher targets, not yet made permanent, but it's about 1% of the population in immigration. And, it would make up for, if met over the next 3 years, would make up for the shortfall we saw in 2020. But it would not keep the age structure of the population constant. You would need annual immigration targets closer to 2%, which is, a very large increase. So that's just the raw numbers. But what matters is not just the people, but as we said off the top, like the skills. And we know that, like some other groups, immigrants tend to be, on average, underemployed relative to their credentials. And we did a study a while ago that showed that, closing the immigration or immigrant employment and earnings gap could be a lift to GDP of $50 billion. And so I guess I'm interested in your views on, we've had some longstanding issues there in credential recognition and employers being equipped to understand and assess foreign work experience. Is there anything you see that is promising in that space and a way that we could better utilize this immigrant labor force?
Well, I think what's promising, going back perhaps to the comments I've already made, is the extent to which post-secondary institutions now, and that's right across the board, it includes colleges as well as teaching universities and research universities, are very much open to, in fact, almost dependent upon an increasing number of international students, and therefore are better able to attract those students and to equip them with the necessary skills. The credentialization issue has always been a difficult one, particularly in the professions. There have been programs. SFU had a program to retrain teachers, for example, to help equip them to gain credentials. But that has been and continues to be a challenge, particularly with the needs in our healthcare sector. One would hope that there could be some progress made in that regard, but I don't think it's going to be a solution, again, that the post-secondary institutions alone will be able to achieve. It would require a collaboration of the kind that you and I have both already discussed. I mean, I guess the other thing, we should be frank, the other major impediment to attracting and retaining talent is housing prices. Particularly in the Lower Mainland, Southern Vancouver Island, the increase in prices in the last year has been extraordinary. It's a major barrier. There's also very low vacancy rates in the rental market, and the cost of rental accommodation is going up. If we can't provide a quality of life to people to make them want to stay here and to make them want to come here and to afford to come here, we're not going to be successful, no matter how well our educational institutions are, no matter how welcoming our labor market is. And that's not just about housing. It's about providing quality healthcare. It's about providing other forms of social infrastructure. Indeed, if we're going to tackle housing, we've got to make sure that we can provide opportunities for people with good transit, because much of the new affordable housing may not be in some of the city centers, much as I like some of the other speakers of this conference, favor greater densification. That alone won't be enough. So we're going to need good transit. We're going to need good digital infrastructure, because increasingly there are opportunities for work to take place virtually, as we know, as this conference is. So there's a major investment in social infrastructure and physical infrastructure, in addition to human capital, that needs to take place if we're going to not only attract more workers from outside the country, but also retain those people who are graduating here and may be lured away if we can't provide them with a good quality and affordable quality of life here.
Absolutely. Housing prices. I'm in Toronto. Housing prices, everyone talks about it every day. It's absolutely a challenge. And it's not just for lower skilled workers. Prices are very high. Could be an impediment to attracting the skilled workforce, as you say. And, we've seen, interestingly, you think about migration, one interesting fact that, is not just about house prices, is about interprovincial migration, and how through coming out of the pandemic, we've seen a lot of people moving from Ontario, for example, or Alberta to the Atlantic provinces. And another province that's been the beneficiary of that interprovincial migration has been BC.
Absolutely.
There's still a lot of questions around, what are the drivers, what are the demographics of some of these groups and motivations, but those are some interesting trends to track against some of these concerns about house prices. And at least in the case of moving to the Atlantic provinces, definitely seems to accord with the dominant narrative there. Just on that, though, what about the prospects of hybrid work arrangements? Do you think that's can take some of the pressure off?
Well, it'll take some pressures off. You probably have tracked those trends more than I have. I hear that there's likely to be more hybrid work arrangements, but not necessarily remote work arrangements in their entirety. What that means in terms of some of the physical infrastructure that's needed to support workers. I mean, there's all sorts of speculation. Our city's going to be hollowed out because of that. To what extent is it going to enable work arrangements that can take place in different ways, maybe with lower costs? I mean, I know one company my son works for, Traction on Demand, has actually opened a presence in Nelson, BC, taking over the old Legion building there because technology and communications allows them to deliver their software and cloud computing programs as well from Nelson as they can from Burnaby or Vancouver. So yeah, there may well be opportunities to spread out employment and for companies to locate and go to places where housing is more affordable and there's a good quality of life. I am a little skeptical as to how much that will take pressure off in terms of the housing market, for example, but I'm no expert in that area.
Yeah, I think that maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned, but I mean, from what I hear and my own personal experience, also there's still a lot of for knowledge workers, a lot of impetus for wanting to be, within commuting distance to be able to meet in person and collaborate. But I don't think that that's necessarily how it's going to end up. There's probably a lot of innovation in this space still to come in terms of optimizing how we collaborate virtually. I think, in some sense, the real experiment starts now. But I also want to point out that I guess that, the moving beyond the local labor market, which hybrid work arrangements allow you to do, provides an opportunity. But I mean, it also means that Canadian workers can be recruited from, other countries or other areas. So we've heard that in the tech sector, for example, some of the major US tech companies have been recruiting in Canada, and the tech sectors are quite worried about what that does for Canadian domiciled firms to recruit talent and innovate. So it kind of goes both ways as well.
Well, and not to put too fine a point on it, I mean, Canada benefited perversely from some of the anti-immigration policies of the previous U.S. government. To the extent the current government of the U.S. is more aware of their need for immigrant labor to fill some of their labor market needs and the shortages that exist, we can no longer count on people coming to Canada simply because they feel unwelcome in the U.S. or because immigration policies in the U.S. are not going to allow them to gain work opportunities. And frankly, again, you're the expert on this, but I believe these labor market shortages are not confined to Canada and the US, they're international. And so the market is becoming increasingly competitive for international talent and international labor. And that's something that we're going to have to factor into our thinking. And again, it puts pressure on us to create a value proposition for workers to come here that isn't just about the job, isn't just about the income, it's about the quality of life and what we can offer so that we can get them here to help continue to build that quality of life and the economy that we'll all benefit from.
Great. I think you've said it perfectly, Andrew. Let me turn to questions now. We have a few in the chat, and if you have some more, please add them. Let me read one. This is a question from Britt Santowski. She talks about the untapped pool of talented people. The gaps will tell you what's missing: women, elders, Indigenous, visible ethnic groups, and differently abled people. Canada is notorious for not training staff, yet most jobs are mastered via training. What is the region doing to ensure doorways are open to the untapped potential that is already here?
Yeah, that is a great question. Well, that is a great question. And I do think that thinking is starting to change in this area, driven in part by good social policy, in part by necessity. I mean, the provincial government, particularly as some of the inequalities in the labor market have really surfaced during the pandemic, has made a major commitment to training initiatives that are designed to bring those groups that have been undervalued or excluded from the marketplace into and to give them greater skills and greater job opportunities. So Innovate BC, for example, is delivering a program called the Innovator Skills Initiative, which is funded by the province and MyTax and others, which is placing workers who have been dislocated and giving them opportunities in growing sectors of the economy and tech positions, not just in the tech sector, but across the economy. I think there is a growing need for greater diversification. The tech sector has not had a very diverse labor force, not as diverse as some other sectors. And I think there's a growing need both for social justice reasons, but also for economic reasons, that if that sector is going to meet its labor market needs, it's going to have to be a sector that is more welcoming and more inclusive of people with disabilities, of Indigenous workers, of workers from groups that have been underrepresented by virtue of their ethnicity or race. So it's starting to happen, driven in part, as I say, by a combination of good social policy, but also economic exigency. But again, I think more needs to be done. The opportunity to bring more women into the labor force by providing adequate childcare. I mean, I've seen some studies, I'm not sure they're RBC, but some studies that suggest the one thing you can do to really pump GDP in the economy is to provide childcare that is affordable for those parents, particularly women who wish to enter the labor force. And to the extent that the federal and provincial governments are now working on that, and to the extent they're successful, that can be a major contributor from a component of the population right now that is not as well represented as it could be. And I do think that RBC has shown that if we can ensure those workers are paid what they should be paid, that would be a further boost to GDP if we could close the gap in income for immigrant workers, for women, for Indigenous workers and others. There also, of course, we haven't talked about it, but I think it's pretty obvious that we're seeing as labor is in shorter supply, particularly in service sectors, that there's going to be increases in pay within those sectors that will have some inflationary pressure as well, but hopefully it can also mean there's more money circulating in the economy from those workers. So there's all sorts of opportunities that we need to focus on.
I think that's right. And I think employers have a big role to play there too, in terms of hiring for diversity. And I mean, the case has been made in many ways about the value of doing that in terms of innovation and output and productivity. So looking for employers, I think, to take a bigger role there as well. Another question here that I think is a very good one, and one that's been a bit of a tough nut to crack, the idea that when people apply for jobs, that, you know, it can seem like HR is doing a bit of a checkbox activity. Does this person have this type of education or this type of experience? We've talked for a while about moving toward a skills-based hiring systems, assessing people for the skills they have, which means, what skills are transferable. So have you seen anything that excites or interests you, Andrew, in terms of how businesses can be more open to transferable skills?
Yeah, I think I am seeing that as businesses have needs that are not being met from traditional labor pools or from traditional practices, they're starting to look at different approaches. They're looking at, for example, providing a full suite of employment offerings to their employees. So it's not just about providing a job and salary. It's also about providing other benefits, making sure there's adequate provision for vacation, for work-life balance, for all those kinds of things. But at the same time, I think, yes, there's more openness to looking at people's competencies through a broader and less rigid lens than simply looking at credentials. I think there's an understanding that people can step up into jobs if they are given adequate support, if they have the right kinds of competencies to begin with, even if they don't have the credentials that necessarily accompany those competencies or the potential. So I know some employers that very much hire on the basis of the skill set of the employee rather than the credentials of the employee and of the competencies as they evaluate them. So I think that is starting to happen.
Yeah, I'm encouraged by that as well. I think you mentioned Palette, other organizations, the Future Skills Center has supported a lot of pilots about rapid reskilling and using, in some cases, AI or digital technologies to understand skills involved in a job and transferability. So I think this is an area where we both need a lot of innovation, and I think we're lined up to learn a lot that could be put to good use here. So I'm hopeful in this area, even though it is, you know, a very tough issue.
I mean, another example in terms of public commitment is I mentioned the Innovator Skills Initiative. Previously, that was only open to recent university graduates, to place recent university graduates into tech positions within companies, both tech and non-tech. This year, it shifted to include people who may not be recent university graduates, may not have the university training, but have the potential to nonetheless be with training to be major contributors within those sectors. So we're seeing a broadening of the talent pool and more focus on those who have been undervalued in the past, but have the potential through training and work placement to in fact be productive contributors and to gain productive employment in the process.
And I think you've opened the door to actually another question on mid-career workers, you know, pointing out that a lot of training opportunities or subsidized training opportunities are available for younger people. And I mean, we've focused a lot at RBC as well on equipping youth for the skills of the future, that if you can adapt educational programming and early work experiences, you can create a foundational skill set that can evolve. And if you will, Canada's labor market can age out of some of the transformation. But, you know, increasingly, I think that's, you know, that maybe never was completely the case. And I think there's maybe a recognition that will not be the case. And so a lot more attention needs to be paid to the mid-skilled worker, whereas I referenced before, you know, an employed, for example, low wage workers are not likely to get that training. And actually the overall rate of access to training is fairly low. So have you, you know, I definitely think it's an important issue. Anything to say on that, Andrew, what you'd like to see or are seeing?
Well, I think there is increased focus on providing youth. I mean, I'm not as familiar with the K-12 system as I am with the post-secondary system, but I am aware that there's a lot of programming, generally aware there's a lot of programming happening even in the high school system to provide young people with work experience, to give them knowledge of the workplace, in some case for placements and the like. And we've already talked about the work integrated learning opportunities, which are considerable in the post-secondary sector here. Doesn't mean that more couldn't occur. There's certainly other youth training programs, and I've mentioned a few that have been expanded in recent years as well. One thing we haven't talked about that is happening as well is greater entrepreneurship training. More and more students in university that I encountered over the last 10 years don't want to work for someone else. They, in fact, want to create their own business opportunities. And thankfully, universities, and this is true of high schools as well, are providing more and more opportunity for young people to gain knowledge of what it is to create a business, to become entrepreneurs, to participate in the economy as business leaders and business developers, as well as employees of others. So that's happening, and that's increasing to a greater extent as well. I only wish there were more young people coming into the workplace, because one of our problems, as you know, is the number of young people coming into the workforce is less than the number of people of my vintage who are leaving the workforce. And that's one of the big challenges we have. Doesn't mean we can't and shouldn't do more to train those young people and up their skills. We've already talked about some ways in which that can and should be done. But it by itself will not address the entirety of the problem we face.
Absolutely. So we have to focus along the work experience continuum. And, you know, just to add on the mid-career workers, I second everything you said on youth and equipping them with future ready skills. In terms of the mid-career workers, I think there's more work for public policy there. And these things that we talked about in terms of pilot programs and studying skills are going to be useful for understanding where there might be, you know, a greater incidence of displaced workers, and what are the skills overlap between those fields and new ones. And I think we have to think about our policy framework and the kind of incentives it gives to, you know, reskilling while working, so that, you know, someone doesn't need to be unemployed necessarily to undertake this skills training. So I think we need to think about our public policy support for training that would affect and help mid-career workers. And I'll let you jump in.
Maybe there's a positive that we can learn from the pandemic too, because again, I'll go to your statistics, which I think bear this out, that there's been a lot more mobility between sectors and amongst sectors during the pandemic, as people have found there aren't economic opportunities for them for employment in the service sector during the pandemic. They have been able, not universally, obviously, but many have been able to shift to different sectors and find employment there. And maybe that suggests that we have not been as creative and as open as we could be to retraining people and helping them to make shifts. The tech sector, for example, we talked about this earlier. I think a lot of people mistakenly think that a job in the tech sector means you have to, be an expert in technology. Not at all. A lot of the jobs in the tech sector that are most needed are in sales, are in management, are in HR, are in skills that exist in many other sectors, and with a bit of retraining, a bit of familiarization, can be transferable and help to support the growth of the tech sector. So maybe we can take a lesson from those who have shown us that they are able to move from one sector to another out of necessity during the pandemic to reinforce that possibility more generally in retraining workers and helping them find new opportunities going forward.
And just to extend that, there's a question here about young educated people who may be overqualified for the entry level roles they take on. I mean, one way in which to kind of solve part of this issue is to ensure that, also youth are employed relative to their credentials. What are your thoughts on the ability to deal with this issue, to accelerate the entry into labor market positions that match the potential of young people?
Yeah, well, I think we need to be careful not to overinterpret this. Often people who have been trained to a higher level need to get to that higher level in the labor force through progression, and hopefully not too long a progression, but they may enter at a level of employment that doesn't fully harness those skills, but hopefully then move up within the labor force into those skills. I think also increasingly jobs which were thought to be of more limited skills are becoming ones that require higher level skills as people adapt to changing technologies and changing needs. But having said that, I think employers now should be, we talked more previously about employers being more open to people who may not check all the boxes. They should be open to looking at people whose credentials may equip them for jobs that they need to fill, even though those people don't have the same degree of experience. And I frankly think whether it's done through pooling on the part of employees or employers rather, or through other measures, employers are going to have to invest more in training than has taken place. There's been an attempt to try to shove training costs more onto the public sector. And as I say, that's some extent driven by the fact that in the past, you hired an employee, you expected to have them for 20 years, so you were prepared to invest in the initial training. Employers have in recent years been less prepared to do that. Work integrated learning has filled the gap to some extent, but not to the extent that's probably necessary. So I think in response to this question, if there are people who come out of university with some of those higher, or colleges for that matter, with some of these higher level skills, but don't necessarily have the work experience, it's going to be up to employers hungry for talent to step up and help to bridge that gap and give those people the opportunity to gain the experience so that their credentials and their skills can be fully realized in the workplace.
Absolutely. I think there's going to need to be more pathways to training and retraining in the economy. Just before we wrap up, we have time for one more question, and there's two good ones here, Andrew, so it'll be a choose your own adventure. You decide what you want to answer. So we talked about the talent continuum, and what about, so the first option, what about older Canadians, the 55 plus? We know they're staying in the labor force longer. Is this a source of talent to address labor shortages over the next few years? And the second question you have the option of answering is, what about retaining talent and companies in BC and in Canada? What are the key factors to ensure that they grow and evolve here and develop their labor forces here?
Well, I think on the first, there clearly is opportunity for older workers to stay longer. In fact, I think it's happening to stay longer in the workforce. Certainly happening in universities, I can tell you that. And that is another potential source of labor that shouldn't be ignored in terms of providing older workers maybe part-time opportunities or opportunities where they can enjoy a greater work-life balance on the life side, but still contribute to the labor market. I think it is happening out of necessity to some extent, necessity both for employers and employees. But I think there's perhaps can be more deliberate efforts in that regard. In terms of the growth and retention, we know in the past there's been a tendency in BC for companies to reach a certain stage of development, particularly in the tech sector, and then to be bought out, and for the IP and the employment very often to migrate outside the province. Happily, that trend is starting to change. We're seeing more companies in BC start to really gain a larger foothold here and invest here. But I think the key will be, I'm going to go back to my old theme, talent. If BC can continue to provide high quality talent to meet the needs of those growing companies, that will be a huge inducement for them to stay. But then again, we have to maintain focus on those other larger issues like housing and the like for that talent to be able to afford to stay and to want to stay. There's also efforts to try to influence capital investments. So the province, for example, has created the InBC investment fund, investment corporation, which is going to provide investment for innovation on the basis that those who accept that investment do so on the basis that they will expand within the province. So there will be some inducement from government to do this. But I think the more important thing is to really provide business with the assurance that there will be the talent needs that they require going forward in human capital, plus the social and physical infrastructure they need to thrive. So those from my point of view, there's no magic in this. It's a matter of all working together to make sure we create the kind of context in which businesses and people who work in those businesses want to stay and want to grow here in BC.
And isn't that the takeaway, that these issues are challenging issues, they're not going away, and that it's going to take a concerted effort to address them, but within there are big opportunities?
I think that is the takeaway. I mean, I believe BC is going through a shift. I think we're shifting from an economy which was based on value extraction to an economy that's based on value addition. That's true in the resource sector as well as in the tech sector. I mean, mass timber and agri-tech and the need for the resource sector to improve its efficiency and increase its value are going to be essential. But in order for that to happen and to happen successfully, there needs to be a lot more collaboration. We have universities with incredible research capacities. We have post-secondary sector with incredible talent contributions to make, but they cannot do it in isolation. They need to interconnect with the business community. Government needs to come to the table. And again, I want to do a real shout out to the South Island Prosperity Partnership and to Rising Economy Week, because this is a demonstration, this very conference, of how we can bring people together, and this organization of how it on an ongoing basis brings people together from those kinds of sectors, plus Indigenous communities and others, to work together to solve these problems. That's the way it's going to happen. And I really want to say how much I respect and admire the work that's going on by South Island Prosperity Partnership in mounting this conference and the work they do throughout the year.
I think we'll leave it there. Andrew, thank you for your incredible insights, and thank you all for joining us. I think this has been a great and informative conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Andrew. That was a wonderful conversation, and I actually can't wait to hear it again once the recording is live and available. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today and for your fantastic questions. They really added to the conversation. We want to thank our sponsors, Douglas Magazine, for sponsoring this important conversation. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, RBC, and to our innovation sponsor, BC Ferries, for supporting Rising Economy Week. Attendees, thank you for joining this session. We encourage you to head back to the Hoover platform to continue the conversation. There you can find the event agenda and information about upcoming sessions. You can head to the community section to check out the exhibitor booths, join virtual meetups, and engage in discussions. The more you engage with the platform, the more points you earn, increasing your chances of winning one of our prizes, small business gift certificates, and books by our keynote speakers. Make sure you check your score in the apps leaderboard throughout the event. Up next at 11, we have Headspace, Why the Future of Work is Employee Wellbeing, followed by a Czech Spotlight at noon with Mark Collins, CEO of BC Ferries. And we're back here again tomorrow morning and hope to see you there. Have a great conference.